I wanted to start off by, first of all, saying a couple of things about the propaganda war, propaganda techniques. I think people will remember this very famous piece of propaganda.
I saw the Iraqi soldiers coming to the hospital with guns.
From the Kuwait propaganda campaign. And one of the things I think we need to take into account about propaganda is the fact that it is both psychological and ideological. The psychological element is designed in a sense to stop us from using our rational and critical faculties, and instead to present us with a series of emotions, which is very difficult for rational people to break through. So when, for example, we're faced with accusations of genocide in concentration camps, this isn't designed to have a critical or rational debate about ethnic policy in Xinjiang. It's designed to evoke certain elements of historical memory amongst a large part of the Western population. I think it's also one of the reasons why it hasn't had quite the same effect in terms of propaganda among non-Western people who have different political backgrounds. One other factor that we need to take into account about propaganda is also that it is ideological, that the West has a conceit, as Radhika said at the beginning, a conceit about modernization equaling westernization. The adoption of a market system, or the introduction or reintroduction of markets, is the reintroduction of capitalism, and capitalism inevitably creates democracy. And this is something which the West sold itself. This isn't something that China fooled anybody on. It's the West that managed to fool itself on this. This is two documentaries, one of which was actually quite good, China's Capitalist Revolution, despite the title, did in fact explore and discuss with a number of the initial architects of the economic reforms in the 1970s. Robert Peston has produced a whole series of rather poor documentaries on China, but he's still considered to be an extremely important figure. This was from The Economist, believe it or not. Rulers of the World read Karl Marx. This is part, I think, of an attempt to kind of embrace Marxism as a kind of academic, critical discipline without it having anything to do with changing the real world. It's the half of the philosophers have only interpreted the world in various ways. Marx and Marxism is fine as long as it's pointing out flaws of capitalism rather than providing actual alternatives to it. That's really a problem, because there is at least one world leader, there's certainly more than one, but there's one that we know very well, Xi Jinping, who certainly does read Marx and takes Marxism very seriously. And this presents a real problem, I think, for Western propagandists, because whilst the New York Times, CNN, Guardian, and so on would spend hours and acres of print poring over every tweet of Donald Trump, every 144 character tweet from him, there's no attempt to try and understand the theory or ideology that has guided the Communist Party of China for the past century, and certainly no attempt really to understand the current developments in China in any way that is ideological or theoretical. This one is a particularly bad example. Stephen McDonnell is an Australian journalist. He's been based in Beijing since 2006, so he spent 15 years in China. And this entire article is basically an essay in why he doesn't understand anything about China, how he can't understand anything about socialism or anything indeed about economics. And unfortunately, that's the medium through which millions of people in the West are being fed news and perspectives about China by people who do not even do they not sympathize with the aims of socialism, with Chinese characteristics. They don't actually get the idea of socialism in the first place. Daniel mentioned the military-industrial complex from Eisenhower's famous phrase. Today, I think we really have something which is actually even more insidious, which is a military-industrial and media intelligence complex. The way in which Secret Service, intelligence agencies feed stories, reports, and so on into the media. It's a kind of source laundering, a way of pushing a military intelligence agenda into the media without it being obvious to the reader or to the viewer where it's actually coming from. The most famous, of course, I think, is ASPI. I think it was Ajit Singh from Grey Zone, in fact, who did the first expose of the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, showing the extent to which it was embedded not only in the Australian military and defence network, but the Western worlds as well. Also funded by countries such as Israel, Japan, and also the Taiwanese authorities also contribute to it. What was interesting to me, though, when I looked through some of the list of the sponsors, was the number of media companies that were involved in sponsoring ASPI, because they include companies like Amazon, Facebook, Google, Microsoft, and Twitter, amongst many others. That's essentially the whole spectrum, if you like, of the online media world. So they're all embedded within this military, industrial, and media intelligence complex. A good example of how this works is the ASPI report called Wiggers for Sale, which was published in 2020. It was actually paid for by the British government. The British Foreign Office paid for the report to be done. When the report was released, it was immediately essentially republished. The executive summary of it was republished in most of the Western press. This happens to be The Guardian, the one on the right. And strangely enough, The Guardian and the ASPI report ended up in a second government report. So the British government essentially paid for a report, had it filtered through the mainstream media, and then used mainstream media reports of the government-funded report to create another government report. So it's a way of the state managing the information cycle, the news cycle. Another way in which media can be distorted and manufactured, and I think the Chomsky term manufacturing consent is a pretty good one, is how editorial bias can be introduced into even something which is relatively neutral or perhaps even positive. This photograph was taken in Hotan County in Xinjiang. The headline here, I hope you can see it, is about, the headline is about a report, another report, alleging demographic democide of the Uyghur population, despite the fact that the photograph itself shows 5 Uyghur children on one motor. You could have that picture taken almost in any part of Southeast Asia or Central Asia, and you'd see something very similar. It's a very normal family portrait, but it's been used here. It's been framed in such a way that it's been done to present itself as being as illustrating demographic democide. The photograph itself it comes from Associated Press. And when I checked where it came from, I found that it had been created on the 20th of September in 2018. However, I'd noticed as well that within the archive, there was a second version of the same photograph, which is actually dated June 29th, 2020. Now that's the same day as the Independent published the story on the demographic democide. And you can see that not only has the caption been changed, but some of the details have been changed. So the submission date has been changed, the caption has been changed, and also the creation date has been changed, despite the fact that it's clearly the same picture. So something clearly happened there within the editorial process. Radhika mentioned at the beginning that one of the problems that we face is the problem of people on the left being taken in by propaganda, Western propaganda, in some cases simply echoing Western propaganda, but also on occasion giving their own kind of left-wing twist to it. Hong Kong's been a particular example of this. This was from a very well-known, very well-read online site called Jacobin. It's called Hong Kong's Trade Unions Are Under Attack, and it makes the allegations that the Hong Kong Confederation of Trade Unions, which is one of several trade union federations in Hong Kong, has essentially been forced underground. What's not mentioned at all in the piece is the fact that the Hong Kong Confederation of Trade Unions has for decades been receiving funds from the United States. This is actually from their own statement that was made back in 2014, where they admitted to having received funding from the American Center for International Labour Solidarity. Now, that's actually part of the National Endowment for Democracy. It's one of the 4 component parts of the NED. Although, again, the HKCTU did not mention that, and it didn't find its way into the Jacobin piece. Perhaps more importantly, the leadership of the HKCTU has been involved in not just receiving American money, but in return, lobbying US congressmen, both Democrats and Republicans, in order to impose sanctions on Hong Kong and China. This is the General Secretary of the HKCTU, Lee Chuk-yan. He's pictured here, included in a nice little photo op with the National Endowment for Democracy itself. And he actually went to Washington in 2019 to support the Marco Rubio Hong Kong Democracy Act bill, which would not only have imposed sanctions on Hong Kong and China, but would have also allowed the United States to insist that Hong Kong imposed sanctions on second countries, third parties, in other words. So named in it were North Korea and Iran, but you can imagine that would also be extended to Venezuela, to Cuba, and to any other country that the United States chose. Amongst the other clauses in the bill were the demand that the United States should be allowed to send as many State Department officials, as many commerce and trade officials to Hong Kong as they deemed necessary. It would, in other words, have turned Hong Kong into what effectively would have been a treaty port, which is what Hong Kong originally was during the Opium Wars. There's also, of course, a very nice connection between Lee Chuk-yan and Jimmy Lai. Jimmy Lai being the media mogul in Hong Kong, the Trump-loving media mogul, a very, very right-wing, xenophobic, reactionary individual. In 2014, it was discovered that he had in fact been secretly funding Lee Chuk-yan's so-called Hong Kong Labour Party. That was paid for by very substantial donations from Jimmy Lai. And I suspect that in the court cases which are coming up to do with the national security law, we're going to find out even more about that. There's also a mention in the Jacobin article about a guy called Leo Tang, who apparently, according to the Jacobin, was arrested for participating in protests. In actual fact, he was arrested for carrying offensive weapons. He was carrying a retractable baton, and he was also carrying cable ties, which some of the protesters stroke rioters actually used as handcuffs to hold people while they were being beaten. So there's something much more to these stories than have been made out. Final point, because I think I'm coming, if I haven't gone over. There's a tremendous concentration of media monopolies to the extent that there is now really no longer any division between the media in terms of broadcast, print, and the entertainment industries, Hollywood and so on. The last month, the BBC ran a political thriller called Vigil. It's set on board, believe it or not, a British nuclear submarine, so you couldn't get better timing for that. And in one of the scenes, an anti-nuclear activist, a very naive anti-nuclear activist, is prevented from defecting or claiming asylum in the Chinese consulate. This is you can see the flag in the background. And this is a dialogue here. He is arrested because he's been in touch with a Russian intelligence officer who's been passing on information. Now, John Rees of the Stop the War Coalition did a very good take apart of this, showing how it was designed to discredit the peace movement. But I have to say that one thing he missed out, and which I personally picked up, was the attempt here to bring in a smear against the obvious character would be Julian Assange, who was also accused, of course, of being someone who was an idealist, but in the end working for Russian interests. So these are very sinister motifs that we see, and they cover everything from mainstream print, online, broadcast media, right through, as I said, to the entertainment industry. So we really have our work cut out to try and expose and try and deconstruct this level of propaganda that's being directed against China at the moment. Thanks.